Hi and welcome to today's video. I've decided to give a makeover to my handmade stained clay palettes. So what I'm doing right now is I have taken some white gesso and I'm going to give a layer of paint over all of these palettes. So when you use gesso, remember to leave the first layer to dry for about 15-20 minutes before adding the next layer for best results. I made these handmade palettes about a year ago using air-dry clay and I painted over it with acrylics and I gave some varnish. Since I've not baked these, they tend to get stained with the color. So you can see how most of these palettes have stains of colors on them, like the one on the right hand side. You can see there's some black, there's some blue, pink and green. So even though some varnish has been given, since I haven't baked these, it's very easy to get the stain onto them. So I decided it's time to give them all a makeover and make them look all fresh and happy. You will notice that when I add the first layer of gesso, it's not completely opaque. So the reason for using gesso also is that it acts as a primer and it helps to ready the surface to paint our acrylics on. It stays much better on it when we add the gesso at the base layer and then add acrylics on top. So I can go over these palettes directly with acrylics, but it will tend to stain a lot faster. So I'm hoping that this helps to make it stay and look fresh for a lot longer than what happened last time. This entire process is a lot of fun, it's very therapeutic, and I do this quite often to unwind. I'm using a flat brush over here to paint the gesso, but if you're not comfortable with that, you can keep switching your brushes. You can even use a round brush for doing this. Don't use a mop brush. You don't need that. You need it only for watercolors, so you don't need to use mop brush over here. So these palettes, I predominantly use them for watercolors and for gouache, which is why they tend to stain a lot. I cannot use these for acrylics because they are not baked, so the paint would just stick onto it once it dries. So if you are going to make palettes like these and you do not have a medium or any means to bake them, then it's perfectly alright to use them for your watercolors and for your gouache and also for your poster paints. Normally, you would not require to add any water to your gesso, but if your gesso is a little bit old or if the cap was left open for some time and some air has gone in and your gesso has dried a little bit or it's become too thick to use, then you can add a little bit of water, but don't make it very watery. This brush holder is, I think, the most dirtiest of the lot. The amount of stains on it is incredibly crazy. I think I just didn't maintain it very well. So now I'm adding the gesso on top of it. And I think that the ones which are like really dark would require quite a number of layers. So again, don't forget that you have to leave them to completely dry for some time. And it should be completely dry before you add your second layer. So while we finished all of these, my first few ones have started drying out. So I'm adding the second layer on top of it and you will notice that you can still see the cat face a little bit. and that's fine. You just have to wait for it to completely dry and then add a third layer, fourth layer. So you can even go up to like 5 or 6 layers if you need to. Normally it would be quite done in about 3 layers. Some of these palettes and brush holders were made in the first batch, and some of them were made a couple of months later in a second batch. So you can see that some of these have like very uneven edges, and it looks like it looks a little funny. And some of them have like very smooth and clean edges. It's also because it took me some time to get used to them. It's a lot of fun. I'll definitely make a video of how to make these kind of palettes by yourself very soon, and I'll put it up. Another tip I would like to tell you is to not have a paper like how I'm having underneath. I keep moving them around so that they don't stick to the paper, because the gesso at the edges would end up sticking onto the paper when it gets dry. So you can use a cutting mat, because normally these things don't stick onto a cutting mat, or just make sure that you keep moving the object that you are painting. Now that most of the ones on the left side have been painted with 2 layers, you can see the difference between the ones on the left versus the right. The ones on the right, they still have quite a bit of translucency of the gesso, so you can still see the base layer color through it, but once on the left hand side you can't really see that. So this is the magic of gesso. You can now wait for this layer to dry and then add the third and the fourth layer. So if I have to go with my acrylics directly, I may need to use a lot of acrylic paint. And like I was saying earlier, the first batch was done with acrylics directly. I did not use gesso, which is probably another reason why the water seeped in through and then the stain stayed. Gesso also comes in black, so if you want to use that, you can do that as well, and then you can add some detailings on top with your acrylic paints. I'm now moving on to adding the third layer of gesso wherever required, and then we will have to turn all of these around and add either paint over it, or you can add gesso. So you can decide, because it's the bottom side, you're not going to really add any colors on top of it in terms of your watercolors or your gouache. So the top layer is what is more important for us to make sure that that is completely covered. With this next layer of gesso, everything is becoming very opaque. I'm hardly able to see the bottom layer of most of the objects except the ones which had a very dark bottom layer. Like this one that I'm painting right now, there are some hints of blue I can see, but I can still salvage this when I directly paint using the acrylics on top of them. So it's okay for you to not add too much of gesso. So now I'm going to be using the Fevicryl white acrylic. So why I use the Fevicryl one is because it already is a little flowy and I don't need to really add any water with it. So that's why I like using this for painting over my objects. So this will dry in a matte finish, and then we will add the varnish, and we can decide whether we want to add matte finish or glossy finish varnish. So I add one layer of acrylics over all of them. I'm going to let it dry overnight. This is how it looks once it's dried overnight, and in the sunlight you can see how even my white papers got like a lot of paint on top of it. So once this is done, I'm going to add another layer of acrylics over them. I'm currently choosing to leave them all white because earlier I had painted some of them with lots of colors and it gets stained really fast, but I really love the white color finished palettes. So I'm going to leave all of these white, and in case you are somebody who likes a pop of color on their palette, then you can use any other color that you want on it. You use acrylics. Definitely for this, do not use watercolors of gouache. It will mix, especially if you add the varnish on top, everything will get smudged. So make sure you use only acrylics because it's also very quick drying. Now that all of my palettes have dried from the front, I have to now move on to adding the paint at the back. This is the point where we are doing our finishing touches, so don't forget to add the paint at the back. Now all of my palettes have dried and they're completely ready to now be varnished. So there are basically two kinds of varnishes. There is the matte finish and the glossy finish. So for this particular one, I'm going to be using the glossy finish. Use a separate brush to add your varnish because this will tend to get a little stiff at the end of it. No matter how much you try to wash it on time and clean it, it tends to happen. So this is a natural thing. You can use about a couple of sizes of brushes. This is a small size palette and it has a lot of small wells. So I'm using a flat brush of a medium size. You could use a bigger size brush if you have like a flatter surface and much larger area to cover. Again, for the varnish, you can wait for the first layer to completely dry for about 15-20 minutes or even longer before you add your next layer. In varnish, you can go about 2 to 3 layers. A minimum of 2 layers will help to keep your product a little more safer for a while. Once it all completely dries and I start using watercolors or gouache on them, there is still a very high chance that it will stain, but at least not as much as it did earlier. And even if it does, it's really easy and simple. I just have to do the same process again, which is very therapeutic, a lot of fun. So I hope you guys also try this out. Once my first layer is done, I'm letting it dry, and once it's completely dried, I will add my next layer. So you can see that even though the first layer is dried, there is quite a bit of gloss that's seen. So this is the fun part about the glossy finish varnish, and the one that I'm using is also non-toxic in terms of the smell. There is not a very strong smell that comes with it, which is a boon, because otherwise you have to wear a mask and it becomes really difficult for you to work on it for a while. So when you're going to choose your varnish, make sure that you check, read all the instructions of how to use them, whether you have to be in a completely open space or you could use it inside your room. There's also another kind of varnish which is like a spray, so even that is something that you can explore and see if that works for you. My varnish is now completely done. I'm going to let them dry, and this is how it looks once it's completely dry. I love the final finish of it, from all the stained dirty palettes to now it looks completely brand new, and it's so glossy. I think once I add my paints, it's going to look amazing, and the beauty of making your own handmade palettes is unparalleled. Thank you so much for joining in today's video. I'll see you soon for the next one.